I have a woefully undersubscribed subreddit, so please do me a favour. If you're a Redditor, head on over to r/postmortem studios and talk about anything related to any of my shenanigans. Peace.
Hello lovelies, you're going to have to put up with the fact that I'm interested in politics for another couple of videos. Here in England we just had local elections. Well, not just in England, there were local elections in various other places around the country, and there were elections in regional assemblies in Ireland, Wales and Scotland as well. I'm not particularly as qualified to talk about local politics in those areas, but for us here in England the focus very much was on the local elections, the council elections, because we don't have a regional assembly for reasons. Now this is a midterm election. It has all the typical characteristics of midterm elections anywhere, in that people see it as an opportunity to give the party in power a bit of a leathering, to express their displeasure and so on, and people who back the ruling parties tend to be complacent and don't see these elections as being as important, which they're not, because they just determine very sort of local, low-level governmental stuff, which is important, but people don't regard it as such. So these kinds of elections, as elsewhere, are taken as an indicator, a kind of poll, really, as to where people are at when it comes to their relationship with the government of the country as a whole. Now, this was always going to be interesting because the Conservative Party has a fairly strong control over Parliament, but they've been doing a lot of things that a lot of people consider to be bad for quite a long time, and things have reached a sort of crescendo. There's Partygate, where a bunch of senior Tories have been found to be in criminal breach of the law by the rules that they set up for people to follow during the heights of the COVID pandemic. There's the cost of living crisis, with fuel bills rising out of control, particularly heating bills for people. Fortunately, we're moving into spring and summer where people don't need their heating on quite so much, but the bills are still ludicrously high. The cost of living has risen much higher than the rate at which salaries have increased, particularly government controlled payments such as support payments for the disabled or the minimum wage and so on. There are a lot of issues that will be familiar to American viewers, as well as ones that are particular to ourselves. Now, local elections are weird in that they're staggered. Some councils elect every 4 years, others elect some of their councillors 1 year, some of their councillors another. Some councils have local elections 3 years out of 4 and then skip a year. It's all very confusing. But this local election, the way in which it was spread out, meant that a lot of the elections were in metropolitan areas, cities, and large towns, which would tend to favour Labour, really, all things being equal at any other time. But it does make them peculiar, and it does mean that it's not quite as big of an indicator of what you might expect as you might otherwise expect. Now, we were anticipating that the Conservatives were going to take an absolute shoeing through this. There is a lot of hatred, a lot of discontent, a lot of upset with the government, particularly as a result of Partygate for the more economically minded, because of the cost of living crisis, and in a lot of metropolitan areas still because Brexit has completely unexpectedly turned out to be a total disaster. So we were hoping that the Conservatives would fail hard, and the Conservatives were hoping that the disaster wouldn't be quite as bad as it could be. Labour were hoping that this would be a sort of decisive set of wins for them, that they would gain really big, and it would stamp a sort of seal of approval upon Labour as we head towards the next general election. Liberal Democrats were hoping to make a comeback, finally, after their disastrous coalition with the Tories some years ago, and the Greens were hoping that the way in which environmental issues have risen up the scale, that they would pick up quite a few seats in local councils. So how did it all turn out? Well, the Tories did take a leathering, but not as bad as we were perhaps expecting, anticipating, or hoping. It's still bad, it's just not bad enough to finally dislodge bullet dodger Boris. Labour, on the other hand, didn't get as much of a breakthrough killer result as they were hoping. The anti-Tory vote was fairly evenly, relatively speaking, split between Labour, the Liberal Democrats, and the Greens. The Liberal Democrats did very well, but they are still repairing the coalition damage and the lack of charisma at the top. The Greens did very well. Obviously, green issues are up the agenda lately. Labour just didn't quite break through, particularly not in the elections that were in the north of the country. Labour always used to have a very solid control of the north, both locally and in terms of national elections. But in the last elections, largely as a result of Brexit and Labour's lukewarm support of it, they lost a lot of control up north. They were hoping this would be some kind of indicator that they could overturn that, but that isn't what's happened. So the end result is the Conservatives did really badly, but it's local councils which they don't care as much about, and it wasn't disastrous enough to kill Boris off. Labour still doesn't have any sort of decisive stamp of approval on Starmer. It shows that they are still very much a metropolitan party, still very much Corbyn's party, though he has changed things a bit. They just haven't had that breakthrough that they need, particularly in the Red Wall, which shows that to some people, xenophobia and the affability of Boris are more important than criminality and neglect and Brexit turning out to be shit. The lingering effect of Brexit is still very much felt. So the practical upshot of this is that Boris is likely, but not certain, to hang on for a bit longer because they weren't bad enough results to mean resign, and the guy doesn't have any sense of shame or honour or responsibility anyway. I just don't think it's enough for the backbenchers to finally oust him. Labour still has a great deal of work to do. The Lib Dems are doing better, but still have a great deal of work to do. And the Greens have done well, but still haven't broken out to become a serious force in British politics. Of course, all of this is blunted because of our first-past-the-post system, which is applied to local elections as well as national ones, and is shitty and desperately unrepresentative. The most important takeaway from all this is that it indicates that some sort of anti-Tory electoral pact is absolutely necessary for the opposition parties to enter into in the general election if they want to stand any hope of dislodging the Tories, who are continually gerrymandering the system to maintain power and stay in power as time goes on. So unfortunately that kind of tactic is necessary. Will they do it? Have they learned their lesson from the last election when they should have done that but didn't? I don't know. I hope so. I hope the opposition parties can set aside their differences and enter into a pact so as not to put up candidates of their own where there's a stronger opposition party. But we'll have to wait and see until we do get an election, and a proper election, and there's no real telling when that will be and whether a lot of these issues will continue long enough. In some ways it's good for Labour that Boris stays in power, because the people who hate Boris really, really hate Boris. Zang.
Said the grinder as it chewed its way through Alice from the crown of her head all the way down to her toes. It ate the lot of her, unfussy, snout to tail, and cleared its plate. It gnashed its way through her dress, her pinafore, her shoes, and her unmentionables, It chewed her hair, devoured her scalp, gobbled up her arms, wolfed down her legs, gorged itself on her torso, noshed on her skin, and gulped her down without so much as a burp to show for it.